So Steve, let me know where we are in terms of, we're a little after 8 o'clock, and are we still waiting on some people to join?
Yeah, why don't we just give them one more minute? Last time
Sure.
I think I waited too long and you ran out of time, so I don't want to do that this time. So let's
That's
get,
just the way, it's par for the course for me. I tend to go right up to the line in terms of
uh-huh.
time. So
That's
there's
okay.
just, there's just so much good content to talk about that I could do this for a couple hours. I
I
won't, I
imagine so.
promise I won't, but what's that?
Is that Pastor John joining us?
No, no, that's actually Kelly's dad. No, Kelly's
Ah,
dad.
cool. Hi. Oh, yes.
feel like I should do like a juggling routine or something while we're waiting.
Well, Dr.
Simon
Brewer,
Hoffman.
I can tell you this. I know you're the PhD in philosophy. For my dad's Christmas present, he got the biography of Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's called like The Duty of a Genius. Is that right, Dad? Is that what it is?
Ludwig Wittgenstein, yeah.
Yeah, Louis Wittgenstein.
Good. Excellent. Fantastic philosopher. That's wonderful. So you read his biography, is that right?
Yeah, I finished it. It's great. It's really a well-written biography of him.
Yeah, excellent.
When I was in college, my focus was on Wittgenstein. I majored in philosophy. And
Excellent. Yeah.
back during the 60s, he was very popular.
Yes. Yeah. Time magazine actually identified him as one of the greatest philosophers of the modern era. So
Right.
yeah, that's a fantastic entry point into philosophy. That's great.
So Dave, why don't we begin? It's already 5 after 8, so
Sure.
again, to want to thank Dave Brewer, to be able to lead our Bible study here for ACC, and we also welcome the congregation from Johns Creek United Methodist Church and family as well. So, David, I leave it up to you now.
Thank you. Thank you all again for having me and for inviting me to be a part of the series. I really appreciate it. Why don't we start with a moment of prayer, and then we will get into today's lesson. Gracious God, again, we thank you for this opportunity to enter into this Lenten study together, Lord, and to look at the book of Ruth in particular, but to look at the Old Testament more broadly and to see the nature and character of who you are and who you call us to be as your people. We ask, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would continue to guide us and direct us to help us to see more clearly who you are, that we might move more in the direction of becoming more like you, and really, Lord, more like your Son, Jesus Christ. We pray all this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So if you'll recall, we're spending the first couple of weeks laying some groundwork to get into the book of Ruth. I thought it would be helpful for us to go back and look at some key passages of the Old Testament that give us some context clues to understand what's actually happening in the book of Ruth. I think if we don't, I said this last week, so there's two sides of this. On the one hand, the more that I study the Bible in general, the Old Testament in particular, the more that I think the book of Ruth is maybe one of the most important books of the Bible and gives us maybe one of the clearest insights into the heart and character of who God is. But in order to see that clearly, we have to do a little bit of background work to figure out what the Bible, what the Old Testament's telling us about who God is in the first place and who we're called to be in response to God. So last week, we began by looking at a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 through 19. In some Bibles, the heading at the top of the passage says that it's the essence of the law. We talked about how that passage boils down the covenant that Yahweh made with the Israelites to two key elements. One is loving God and worshiping God, but the other is caring for the defenseless, for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. And we're called to do that because that is what God does. God is the kind of God who cares for the defenseless. And in that passage, Yahweh reminds them that I first loved you when you were slaves in Egypt. I brought you out of Egypt, your ancestors out of Egypt, and in doing so demonstrated the kind of God that I am. Therefore, you should do the same thing. And really what it comes down to is our act of worshiping God is demonstrated in how we care for the people that God cares about. So it's one of the reasons we went to a couple different passages. It's one of the reasons why Jesus says that the greatest commandment is really two. You can't separate them. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. You can't separate them out. We also looked at the first chapter of Isaiah, where Isaiah rants and rails against the Israelites for their empty worship of God and says, Yahweh says, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of your empty worship of me. If it's not accompanied by justice, by how you're caring for the defenseless, for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the poor, right? So this is a core aspect of the Old Testament. It's a core aspect of the covenant. And one of the things, Isaiah is an example of this, but one of the things that the prophets continue to call the people back to is covenant faithfulness. And what they mean by that is not just worshiping God alone, apart from other gods. It's all of this. Are you not just worshiping God, but in worshiping God, are you caring for the defenseless, right? Today, what I want us to do is look at the book of Judges for a couple of reasons. I mentioned this last week that the book of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. So that alone is a good reason to kind of talk about the book of Judges sort of broadly to give us some context for what's going on in Ruth. But then more specifically, these are supposed to be contrasting examples of what it looks like to live into this covenant. In the book of Judges, we get the prime example of what not to do, what it looks like when we move away from this covenant expectation that Yahweh has with his people. The book of Ruth is as I said, the contrasting example. So by the time we get to the end of the book of Judges, the story we're going to read today, and by the way, disclaimer, parental advisory, warning, the main passage we're going to read today is it's a really hard passage to read. There's an Old Testament scholar. She happened to be my Old Testament professor in my master's program. I just sort of lucked out on this, but she's a well-known Old Testament scholar named Phyllis Tribble. She wrote a book called Texts of Terror, and the passage we're going to read today is one of the ones that she identifies in that book. I mean, it's a very gruesome story, but it's gruesome for a reason. If you pluck it out of context and say, is this what the Bible's about? Yeah, it looks horrible, but it served in context, it serves as a cautionary tale. It's designed to tell us this is what happens when we move away from the covenant that Yahweh intended, when we move away from the heart and character of who God is. So by the end of the book of Judges, we have this really bad taste in our mouth. And then we turn, the next book is the book of Ruth. And it says, the very first verse, the first chapter says, during the time that the judges reigned. And then we get this other story that is a beautiful story of these three main people who exhibit this covenant perfectly. They exhibit the character and nature of who God is exactly the way that Yahweh intended it. So it's worth comparing the two books. It's worth kind of looking at these and seeing the contrasting picture. So today we're going to look at sort of the negative side of this. And like I said, please be warned, this is not an easy story to read for a number of reasons. And it should leave us on a cliffhanger, right? I mean, by the end of today's lesson, it should make you want to come back to hear the good side of the story, right? To hear the resolution to this and moving into the book of Ruth. Let's talk a little bit about the book of Judges broadly, and then I want us to look at a particular chapter and then talk about that in detail. So in general, the book of Judges is this experiment in what it looks like for the Israelites to live in this covenant relationship with Yahweh. So remember, when Yahweh makes this covenant with the Israelites, the idea is that they're not to have any other king other than Yahweh. They're to live in this sort of harmonious relationship with each other and with Yahweh. And by being obedient to Yahweh, they're supposed to care for the defenseless and the poor, foreigner. And the idea is, we talked about this a little bit last week, but the idea is that the other nations around them will look at this group of people and see something different, right? They'll look at them and say, what's different about that group of people? They seem to care about other people that most people don't care about. They don't have any king, and yet they seem to function really well. What's going on there? And in asking that question, they're supposed to come to the conclusion, oh, they worship this God called Yahweh. And again, I mentioned this last week, but the best example of this is when the Israelites first go into the promised land, they send some spies into Jericho. Those spies are welcomed into the house of Rahab, a prostitute. Rahab is a citizen of Jericho, so she's a non-Israelite, and she's a prostitute. I mean, she checks all the boxes of what she shouldn't be, right? But she welcomes them into her home and says, I've heard about this God that you follow. I've heard about Yahweh. Will you please protect my family when you come into Jericho, right? That's exactly what Yahweh's looking for. Yahweh's looking for the Israelites to set this radically different example of what it looks like to be a group of people, one that raises the eyebrows of people like Rahab and who want to say, I want to know more about this God you worship, right? So the Israelites, they during the book of Joshua, they move into the promised land, they conquer the promised land. After the book of Joshua, we move into the book of Judges, and the book of Judges really takes place during this time period where they have no king, they are settled in the promised land, and they're supposed to be living out this covenant relationship where they have no king except Yahweh, and they live obediently in relationship with Yahweh and with each other. They're caring for the defenseless, and the nations around them should be seeing this. But what we see throughout the book of Judges is this this cycle where they begin, they start off at being obedient, then they move away from that and wind up. So usually, sorry, over Zoom, I'm a bit limited. When I'm teaching this in person, I can draw a diagram on the whiteboard, or if I have my computer with me, I sometimes have it on the computer. So just imagine a circle. I'm going to try to put my hand here in the visual field of the box. So imagine a circle. They start off obedient, but then what happens is they move away from that and they wind up disobeying Yahweh or moving away from the covenant with Yahweh. Then they wind up getting into some kind of trouble, usually military conquest of some kind. The other nations take over, defeat them, whatever. They then cry out to Yahweh because they've gotten themselves in trouble. Yahweh then raises up a judge. And a judge, by the way, is not what we think about a judge today. This was a different function. They were sort of a warrior ruler, a spiritual warrior ruler, Yahweh would raise up to deliver them out of whatever predicament they were in, right? So Yahweh would call up a judge to deliver them. They would be delivered, and then they return to obedience, right? And this cycle repeats itself over and over again throughout the book of Judges. But more than that, it's actually a downward spiral. So the cycle repeats itself, but it gets worse and worse and worse over time throughout the book of Judges. So we start the book of Judges. One of the very first judges that we read about is a woman named Deborah, and she exhibits all the qualities that Joshua did. She has full confidence in Yahweh. When they're challenged by their enemies, she says, we're going to go and take care of this and have, trust that Yahweh is going to deliver us and take care of this. And so she's sort of the shining example at the beginning of the book of Judges of what this should look like. She's carrying on the tradition that Joshua set for them. By the end of the book of Judges, does anybody know who the last judge is that we read about in the book of Judges? I know you know who he is. I just don't know if you know which one's the last one, that he's the last one.
Miss Samson?
It is Samson. And, thumbs up, thumbs down. How does he rank as a human being in general, much less a judge, right? Thumbs down, right? So not really a trick question. He's a pretty terrible judge. He does not do what God calls him to do, right? And he's constantly getting himself into trouble. And it's not until the very end of his life, when he's blind and he's been arrested, that he finally, cries out to Yahweh and pushes the pillars and accomplishes what God wants him to do. But he's a pretty poor example of a judge. And this is kind of the spectrum that we're looking at here. We start off with someone like Deborah, and we wind up with somebody like Samson. And so it's this sort of downward spiral. The last 2 chapters of the book of Judges show us what it looks like when we get to the very bottom of that spiral, when we move as far as imaginable from the heart and character of who Yahweh is and of what the covenant was supposed to look like. And this is where I want to actually get into one of those chapters. So we're going to look at chapter 19. It's actually, let me double check something real quick here. It's actually the last 3 chapters. So we're only going to read 1 chapter today. But I want us to read chapter 19. It's a relatively long chapter, a long story, but I think it's really important to read the whole thing and to talk about it. Are we okay with that? Okay. Also, again, parental warning. This is not for the faint of heart. Would anybody like to read it? I'm happy to read it. I know it's a long passage, so if you all want to take turns or if you just want me to read it, I'm fine either way. But would somebody like to read?
Can you just repeat what the passage is?
Yes, it's Judges chapter 19.
Okay, thank you.
I'll
can
go
read it.
ahead and read. What's that?
I can read it if you
Oh,
like.
fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. A Levite and his concubine. In those days, Israel had no king. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him a servant and 2 donkeys. He took him into her parents' home, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay, so he remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. On the 4th day, they got up early, and he prepared to leave. But the woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go." So the 2 of them sat down to eat and drink together. Afterward, the woman's father said, "Please stay tonight and enjoy yourself." And when the man got up to go, his father-in-law persuaded him, so he stayed there that night. On the morning of the 5th day, when he rose to go, the woman's father said, "Refresh yourself, wait till afternoon." So the 2 of them ate together. Then when the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the woman's father, said, "Now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day is nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way home." But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went toward Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. When they were near Jebus and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at the city of the Jebusites and spend the night." His master replied, "No, we won't go into any city whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah." He added, "Come, let's try to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." So they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah and Benjamin. There they stopped to spend the night. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them in for the night. That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the inhabitants of the place were Benjamites, came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" He answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, where I live. I have been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me in for the night. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for ourselves, your servants, me, the woman, and the young man with us. We don't need anything." "You are welcome at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the square." So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys. After they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and set her outside to them. And they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt. Just imagine, we must do something. Speak up."
Thank you very much. Excellent reading of the story. Let's talk about a bunch of things here. So first of all, when it says at the very beginning, when it says that the woman left because she was unfaithful to the Levite, let's be very clear. The implication here is actually that he had been abusing her. There's a couple context clues here. So first of all, part of what's happening here is that in a patriarchal society, the fact that she left was the act of unfaithfulness. So it's not that she was unfaithful and then left. The fact that she left was what constituted the unfaithfulness. And it just happens to be written in sort of patriarchal terms. But the implication is that she left because there was some kind of abuse. And then the second context clue is that he goes to plead with her to bring her back, implying that he recognizes he did something to drive her away. So the story begins with abuse, right? This is not a story about a woman who was unfaithful and left and abandoned her man. It's not what's happening. She's already being abused by this Levite, which already gives you kind of some sense of where we are in the book of Judges. So she leaves to escape the abuse. Now, the Levite pursues her to try to plead with her to return. He goes to the father-in-law's house, and what does the father-in-law do?
He shows generosity to the man.
Good. Generosity. What else? What other words might we use? So generosity.
Like the hospitality to stay.
Hospitality. Yeah. Excellent. So both generosity and radical hospitality. The reason that the story has, so the father-in-law is generous, but then he goes above and beyond that, right? He keeps asking him to stay a day longer, a day longer, a day longer. And all of this is not just generosity, it's radical hospitality. Today, when we think about hospitality, we think about making somebody feel comfortable in our home. But in this context, hospitality is part and parcel of the covenant we've been talking about. It's going to any lengths to care for somebody who might be defenseless. And there's a couple, again, some things we need to keep in mind here. So first of all, the Levite is sort of, I mean, these are all Jews. The Levite, his concubine, his father-in-law, they're all part of the Jewish community. The Levite has gone into a foreign country to retrieve his concubine. So he's a foreigner in some sense, right? He's out of his own context. And this father-in-law recognizes that he's a foreigner in the sense of being in a new place and is trying to care for him. Also, do you know how Levites, how do I ask this question? Do you know how Levites were able to provide for themselves in general?
To my understanding, so that's why I'm curious what the study, aren't Levites priests?
Yes. So the easy way of saying it is all priests came from the Levite tribe, but not all Levites were priests. So it's not clear whether he was a priest or not. We're not clear on that. But he was from the tribe of Levi, and all the Levites. Again, let me say it this way: all priests came from the Levite tribe, but not all Levites were priests. So I don't know that we have any sense that he was a priest necessarily. He could have been. We just don't know. But the question I'm asking actually applies to all Levites, regardless of whether they were priests or not. So do you know how Levites were cared for or how they provided for themselves in the context of the larger Israelite community? So so they depended on the provision of the other 11 tribes. They were not to provide for themselves or work for themselves. The other 11 tribes, part of the tithes that they gave to Yahweh and to the Israelite community were then reallocated to care for the Levites, again, because many of the Levites went on to perform the function of priests. So very similar to what we do with pastors today, right? I mean, we don't expect pastors to go, usually, it depends on the circumstances, but today, we don't expect a pastor necessarily to go have another job in addition to leading the church. We provide the financing for the pastor to lead the church, right? So Levites depended on the provision of the rest of the Israelite community. And so here again, the Levite is not only kind of a foreigner in this context, but he's also, I mean, he has no means of providing for himself more broadly. He already depends on the generosity of the Israelites to begin with. And so here we have at the very beginning of the story a prime example of what we should be doing in keeping with this covenant we've been talking about, right? This father-in-law recognizes that his responsibility toward Yahweh and toward the covenant is to care for people who can't care for themselves. And here he has a Levite who is in a kind of foreign town, another town that's not his own hometown, and he's going above and beyond what's asked of him to care for and provide for this Levite, even though the circumstances aren't the best, right? Even though that his own daughter theoretically has been abused by him, he's still willing to go above and beyond to care for this Levite, right? Eventually, after several days of this, the Levite insists on leaving. And as they're traveling home, they have to make a decision to stay in some place because they can't make it all the way home. And they have two choices. One is Jabus and one is Gibeah. Jabus is closer and Gibeah is a little farther away. They decide to go to Gibeah instead. Why? There's actually kind of two answers to the question. One is sort of given in the text itself, and the other one is we have to kind of read between the lines. But what's the reason the text gives us? If you look at verse 12, he gives us the reason.
Because they're not Israelites.
They're not Israelites. I mean, that's one reason. They're not Israelites. But why is it important that they're Israelites? What is he looking for from the Israelites that he does not expect to find from non-Israelites?
Hospitality.
Hospitality.
Yeah.
He's expecting what he just received from his father-in-law, right? That this is a part of the covenant expectation. We show hospitality to those who are strangers in our community, those who can't provide for themselves. And we've just experienced this radical hospitality from the father-in-law, and now we have to stay the night in some place. Our chances are better going to an Israelite community where we will expect to receive the same kind of radical hospitality that we've just received than going to a non-Israelite community where we don't know how they'll receive us, right? So they go on to the Israelite community, to Gibeah. They immediately walk into the town square. And what does it tell us about the town square? So we're in verse 14. What does it say in verse 14 and 15?
No one offered them any hospitality.
Yeah, they went into the town square and nobody came to greet them. And this was, again, it's important to understand this. This was a part of the hospitality customs. When you come into a town square, you should be greeted by the community. Since you're an outsider, since you're a foreigner, you should immediately be greeted by somebody in the community to take you in and to care for you. And again, this is couple of things. I'm repeating myself. I think it's worth doing this. First of all, this is a part of the covenant expectation. As faithful Israelites, they should be on the lookout for foreigners who are coming into their community that they don't recognize. And they should immediately be extending some sort of hospitality or some sort of greeting to care for that foreigner who has no means of providing for themselves in a foreign place, right? That's just a part of the covenant expectation. Also, I mentioned this earlier, this requires a bit of a shift in thinking for us. Because again, we think about hospitality as making somebody kind of feel comfortable in our home, or when we're at church, greeting somebody when they walk in, saying, hi, how are you? But in these ancient Near East contexts, and even today in the Middle East, there's a sense of hospitality that I don't think we really still have in our culture today. So I'll give you a contemporary example. My doctoral mentor went to Tehran. This was years ago, but she went to Tehran to give a lecture. And while she was there, she had a Iranian guide who was taking care of her and driving her around. And the discussion of like U.S. Iranian politics came up, and the question of like what would happen if there was a revolt and some sort of like what's the word I'm looking for? Some sort of revolt against America or whatever, like what would happen. And he said, the moment you walk into my home, I have a responsibility to care for you no matter what. Almost implying like I would have to die for you to make sure that you aren't harmed, right? This is the kind of hospitality we're talking about. It's not just making somebody sort of feel comfortable. It's going above and beyond to care for the safety and provision of somebody who is a foreigner in your community, right? And a part of that expectation is, again, when somebody comes in your town square, you immediately recognize that. You immediately go up to them and say, hey, why don't you come to my home? I'll feed you, I'll house you, I'll take care of you. This is the kind of hospitality that's expected. And yet they go in and nobody comes and greets them, right? But then somebody does come and greet them. And who is this? Verse 16, who's the person who does welcome them in?
An old man, someone who's also from Ephraim.
Yes, he's an old man, and he's also not from Gibeah. He's from Ephraim. He's a foreigner himself. So the only person who actually comes in and cares for them is this old man, right? It shouldn't fall to an older man to do this in the first place. It should be the younger members of the community doing this. And he himself is a foreigner, right? He's not even a member of Gibeah. He's a foreigner, and he does what he's supposed to do. He says, "Where are you from? Who are you? Come to my home. I'll take care of you," right? "I'll provide for you." Then finally, the community does come and greet them, but what do they want to do? And instead of asking the question, I'll just go ahead and fill in the blanks here. They want to assault them. And the point here, this is really important. It's easy to get lost in the sexual component of this, but that's not really the emphasis. The emphasis here is this is the diametric opposite of what hospitality is. If you were to imagine radical hospitality on one side and its exact opposite, this is it. A public display of assault is the worst thing that you could do to somebody, right? And so what we're seeing here is that the people of Gibeah, the Israelites, have come so far from the heart and character of who Yahweh is and what the covenant is supposed to be, they've actually become worse than the Egyptians, right? I mean, it's one thing to enslave people. It's another thing to do this, to want to assault them publicly in this sort of way, right? It's the most violating, it's the most humiliating, it's the most inhospitable thing that you could conceive of doing to another human being. This is how they greet them, right? And so remember, we have to keep this in context of the book of Judges, this downward spiral. So the idea is they start off with Deborah and living in this perfect relationship with Yahweh as their king. They're supposed to love Yahweh by caring for the defenseless. But over time, that spiral goes down and down and down and down until we get to this. This is how far we've come from the heart and character of who Yahweh is and who we're supposed to be, right? And it's not just the people of the town, it's the Levite as well. The story begins with the Levite having abused his concubine. And then this last bit of the story, he thrusts his concubine out for them to ravage her, right? So again, this isn't about homosexuality. It's not even about sexuality per se. It's just about violent inhospitality, right? Is really what this is about. How we can violate somebody in the worst way imaginable. And the Levite is complicit in this. He throws her out there without any regard for her as a human being. It started off with him abusing her and having to chase her to get her back. And now he cares so little about her that he thrusts her out to this group of people. Good adjective for that, or good descriptor for that. They then ravage her. The next morning he gets up, he goes out, he doesn't tend to her, he doesn't care for her, he just barks an order, "Get up," and we're left with the implication that she's dead. He doesn't care, right? Takes her home, cuts her up, sends her to the other tribes of Israel. And what this winds up doing is it leads to the first civil war within the Israelite community. So the next chapter, we read about this civil war that's instigated by this whole situation. But this is sort of the climax of the book of Judges. This is how far we've come from the heart and character of who Yahweh is and what the covenant was designed to do. The picture that we're supposed to have is sort of this idyllic picture of living in harmonious relationship with Yahweh and with the rest of the Israelite community and caring for the defenseless. By the end of the book of Judges, we've come so far from it that we actually want to violate and harm the defenseless rather than care for them. Really quick, just to kind of, again, like I said, we get to the end of the book of Judges and we have this really bad taste in our mouth. And so we want to run for some solution. And that's really what the book of Ruth is about, right? At the very end of the book of Judges, we turn the page and we start off with the book of Ruth and we wind up getting a story that's radically different from this one. We get a story of a Jewish woman who goes to a foreign land and experiences hospitality by these two foreign daughters-in-law Orpah and Ruth. Ruth continues to exhibit that hospitality and grace and love to Naomi by going back with her. Boaz welcomes them back and cares for them, right? So, I mean, these are all the things that we're going to get into when we get to the book of Ruth, but these are the contrasting pictures, right? Here's what it looks like at the end of the book of Judges when we don't honor the covenant and when we don't honor the heart and character of who God is, when we stop caring about the defenseless, the poor, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, when we stop caring about them, this is who we become. But when we turn the page and go into the book of Ruth, this is what it can look like when we do those things. Let me pause here. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
I find it interesting that when I was reading certain parts of this passage, it does kind of remind me a little bit of the way Jesus was born. Like, kind of like somebody else showed hospitality to Mary and Joseph. And I don't know, I don't know if my Bible knowledge is correct, but wasn't Mary and Joseph like asked to go away for like 3 years too? Like, I don't
Yeah,
know, something like that.
yeah, there's a couple different stories there. So
Mhm.
in the book of Matthew, they do flee from Herod. We get a story in Matthew that is very, very similar from the story in Exodus with Moses. The sort of story where Herod wants to kill all the children under 2. Mary and Joseph with Jesus have to flee from Bethlehem. They flee into Egypt. And so it's sort of this, it's a story that's deliberately designed to parallel the stories about Moses. Because one of the things that Matthew wants to do is identify Jesus as the new Moses, or that he surpasses Moses, but he's sort of the new Moses. So it's a story that deliberately echoes the story in the book of Genesis, or in Exodus, excuse me. So there's that story, and then I think it's in Luke where it says something about there was no room for them in the inn, right? And you mentioned something about having hospitality from somebody else. Ironically, they don't they don't quite receive the hospitality, so they go. There's no room in the inn. I guess the implication. I have to go back and read the exact language. If the implication is the innkeeper allows them to use the stable in the back or whatever, right? So I mean, but yeah, I mean, so we are to see Jesus more broadly in the context of all of this. First of all, let me connect some dots here. So first of all, we talked about this last week. Ruth, we're going to learn, is the great grandmother of Jesus, right? So Jesus is literally in line with Ruth in the genealogical line of Ruth, right? But also in exhibit, we believe that Jesus is the fullest revelation of who Yahweh is, of who God is. And so even his birth reveals this. Jesus wasn't born in a palace. Jesus wasn't born to Herod, right? He wasn't born to the king or the pharaoh or whatever the ruler was. He was born in a lowly stable, right? The first people who come to visit him are shepherds. In the book of, we talked about this last week, in the book of Luke, his first sermon, he quotes from the book of Isaiah and says, I have come to proclaim good news to the poor, right? Sight for the blind, release for the captive. I usually can quote this, and I'm not doing a very good job of it. All the things we've been talking about, right? I mean, his whole ministry is in keeping with everything we're talking about, right? So Jesus is the best. He's the ideal counterexample of what we're reading here in the book of Judges, right? The book of Ruth is the immediate counterbalancing story to the book of Judges in the Old Testament. But all of this is pointing to ultimately what God is going to do in revealing God's character and nature and who Jesus is. Jesus is the one who perfectly remains in right relationship with Yahweh and is always caring for the poor and the defenseless. That's all he does. He's constantly healing the sick and feeding the hungry and casting out demons and all the things that are in keeping with this covenant, right? It's exactly who he is. So excellent insight. Yes. Any other thoughts?
There's a lot of disturbing themes in this passage, but the one that I'm still grappling with right now is the real anger of the Levite when he gets home. To prompt him to cut up his wife and send it all out to the rest of the country. I think he's upset that he wasn't treated well, in that other village, and has no regard at all about his wife, and just uses the wife as just an excuse, to rouse up,
Yeah.
the people. But
There
to me, the
are-
sense that I get is that he's just upset that he was not treated properly, and
Right.
uses this as an excuse.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's kind of two levels of sickness here. One is sort of this, in some sense, his anger is justified about what Gibeah has done, right? That he is, in some sense, rightly angry that Gibeah has come so far from the covenant of that Yahweh has created with them, and has some amount of righteous indignation about that. But at another level, his response to that is equally disturbing and sick, right? And reflects the fact that he is also pretty far from the heart of Yahweh. Because his response is not to call the people together and to talk about it, right, or to pray about it. His response is to callously cut up this concubine that he's been abusing from the start of the story and has been indifferent to her, at the very least, in her own abuse, and send her body parts to instigate this civil war, right? So there's all of it. The whole thing is disturbing. That's a great word. The whole thing is disturbing, and the whole thing, from the Gibeonites to the Levite himself, are reflections of how far they've come from the heart and nature of God. One more thing I want to highlight here, I just remembered, and we're running out of time. Really quick, does this story remind you of any other story that you've read in the Old Testament before?
It reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes. It's almost beat for beat the same story. The names are different, but if you go and compare them, I think this is just a fascinating coincidence, but this takes place in Judges chapter 19. That story takes place in Genesis chapter 19, but they're almost beat for beat the same. Right. In the story of Genesis, it's the three angels who come into the town of Sodom. They're not welcomed by anybody. And eventually it's Lot, who actually was an outsider. He's not originally from that town either, who comes and welcomes them in the town and greets them the same way. Almost exactly the same scenario. Right. And the point is the same. A lot of people use that as a story to sort of rail against homosexuality. And I'm not here to talk about that issue necessarily, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is exactly what we're talking about tonight. It's this radical inhospitality that's being demonstrated in how the town is, first of all, neglecting these strangers, but then when they do show up, they're violent toward them in the worst way imaginable. And that's why I noted this last week, but I want to go back to it here today. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 through 17. I won't read the whole thing again. You can read it on your own time. I just want to highlight a couple things. So first of all, to review, and I said this at the top of today's conversation, this whole thing is an extended, oh, my vocabulary is not working today. It's an extended diatribe against the Israelites because they are doing all these sort of ritualistic practices and worshiping Yahweh, but they're not seeking justice. They're not caring for the oppressed, the fatherless, the widow. And that's in verse 17, Isaiah brings that home. He says, stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow, right? So the first few verses are Isaiah on behalf of Yahweh railing against them for these empty worship practices, and yet they're not caring for the defenseless. And he starts off in verse 10 by saying, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom, listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Those terms should take on a different connotation for us now. What Isaiah is implying in recalling those names is what we just read about here in the book of Judges. You people who don't care about the defenseless. It's going to be worse for you than it is for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, because they didn't care about I'm actually quoting Jesus. Jesus in the Gospel of Luke says it's going to be worse for you than the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the exact line. And Jesus is implying the same thing. It's not about sexual morality. It's about how you care for the defenseless. When you stop caring, plug us all in here, when we stop caring for the defenseless, when we stop seeking justice for the oppressed, the fatherless, the widow, the foreigner, when we stop doing that, we are becoming more and more like Gibeah and like Sodom and Gomorrah, because that's the real object lesson. That's the real point of those stories, is to lift these up as cities who ceased caring for the defenseless. They stopped seeking justice. And this is where they went, right? So the lesson for us as modern readers is, where are we on this issue? In serving Christ and serving God, are we continuing to worship Yahweh by caring for the least and the lost, seeking justice for the oppressed, for the fatherless and the widow and the orphan? I'm jumbling terms here. Or are we not? Are we oblivious to those? Right? And when we become oblivious to those, we have a danger of moving in the direction of places like Sodom, Gomorrah, and Gibeah. Take heart. Next week, we will read a beautiful story. We'll begin reading really 4 chapters over the next 4 weeks. A very beautiful story of 3 people who do this exactly right. So yes, today, as Steve said, today is a story filled with lots of disturbing imagery. It is not comfortable, and it's designed to sort of end as a cliffhanger. What happens next, right? Where do we go from here? And the book of Ruth is sort of a counterweight to that. Here's what it could look like. Okay. Any final thoughts or comments, questions, concerns? Well, we are about out of time as it is, so shall we close in prayer? Is that fitting at this point? Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, who exhibited your love and grace and compassion in the fullest and most complete way possible. And we thank you, Lord, for your word that shows us the contrasting images, Lord. It shows us both what we don't want to be and what we're called to be. And we ask, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would continue to move in our community, in our church, in our individual lives as well, to shape us and to mold us more and more into likeness of your Son, Jesus Christ, the one who was ultimately concerned about the poor and the defenseless, the fatherless, the widow, for the sinner, for all of us. Help us to grow more into his character and likeness, that we might exhibit the heart of God in our lives. We pray all this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you all very much.
Thank
you, Dave.
you.
Appreciate it.